Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Roxana Maria Arash. I am a faculty fellow at the Hagop Kevorkian Center for Near Eastern Studies at the New York University. And as part of the center's public engagement and outreach, we are organizing this webinar series titled Archives and Dialogue. The idea at the heart of this project is that archives are never just collections of old photographs or dusty documents, like I always tell my students. They are decisions about what matters, what gets kept, and whose stories get told. Archives and Dialogue brings together archivists, scholars, and cultural practitioners from the Middle East, North Africa, and the United States to ask hard questions about who holds the archive, who is missing from it, and the politics of cross-regional collaborations and differences. So my colleagues will be sharing information about the center and today's session in the chat. So please look out for that if you want to know more about the events that we are organizing. Now, today's webinar is titled The Gendered Lives of Photographic Archives. The title started from the idea that the camera lens and the gender lens work in similar ways. Both decide what comes into focus and what stays out of frame. Today, we turn the lens on the archive itself, whose labor built it, whose image is inside it, and whose story it was never designed to tell. Our participants will speak from their own professional practice, how they navigated gender silences, surfacing the invisible labor of women in archives, and finding ways to work against the grain of the archive itself. Now, before I introduce our participants, a brief word about another dimension of our project, what we call archival activations. These are multimedia works where invited artists and activists reinterpret and critique archival material and the narratives they convey. Now, for this webinar, we invited Hadeel Alkhesaifi, a graduate student in NYU's Museum Studies program, so a graduate student of ours, to create an activation drawing on photographs from the Akkasah Photographic Archive at NYU Abu Dhabi. The result is called Reborn Sounds, and I will let Hadeel tell you more about it herself just a bit later. The link to the archival activation will also be included in the chat. And finally, before we begin, I want to acknowledge something that cannot go unsaid. Several of our colleagues today are based in or connected to regions living through war, occupation, and ongoing violence. The Middle East is not an abstraction for this project. It is where our colleagues work, where their communities are, where the archives we discuss live and sometimes disappear. We are deeply grateful that they are here, and we do not take that for granted. And we hold together what I like to call a radical hope for justice, for peace, and for the right of all communities to preserve and tell their own stories. And now our participants. So we have Jonathan Burr, who is an active archivist at NYU Abu Dhabi and the digitization lead for both the Akkasah Photographic Archive and the Arab Art Archive, with a decade-long focus on the vernacular photographic heritage of the Middle East. We have Ibrahim Mohammed Ali, who is currently the head of manuscripts and research at the Department of Culture and Tourism in Abu Dhabi, and formerly led archival processing at Al Mawrid Arab Center at NYU Abu Dhabi. He has preservation experience at the Met, the National Gallery of Art, and the Smithsonian. The third speaker will be Ibrahim Rantisi. He is the digital curator and archivist at the American Center of Research in Amman, Jordan, and he brings together his journalism, photography, and content strategy in his archival practice. And as our respondent, we have Giulia Martini. She has worked for over 15 years in photographic and documentary heritage and has been responsible for the historical photography and prints collection at Qatar National Library since 2015. And finally, we have Hadeel Alkhesaifi. She's a multimedia artist and museum studies graduate student at NYU, whose research focuses on Arab art and Gulf museums, and whose work you will encounter today through Reborn Sounds archival activation. So to all of you, thank you. And finally, a quick word on how today will run. We will hear from each of our speakers. Giulia will then offer a response, and we will close with an open Q&A. Please use the chat for questions as they come to you. My colleagues and I will be keeping an eye on it throughout because there are so many of us. We would like to have this Q&A in a bit of organized fashion. Also, today's session is being recorded and will be shared on our website and social media afterwards, of course, with the approval of our speakers. With that, let us begin. I will give the floor to Jonathan.
All right, thank you. I'll share my screen here for everyone. Let's see here. Okay, there we are. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here and having me here. As Roxana said, my name is Jonathan Burr, and I work as a digital archivist for both the Akkasah Photography Archive in Abu Dhabi, and also the Arab Art Archive, which is a part of Al Marid Arab Center for the Study of Art, also at NYU Abu Dhabi. I've been working as an archivist at NYU Abu Dhabi for a little over a decade. I'm honored to be a part of Archives and Dialogue. Thank you especially to Roxana and the Kevorkian Center, who have been very understanding regarding the challenges of those of us in the Gulf are facing at the moment. And also a special thanks to Hadeel, who created such a thoughtful, engaging interaction with Akkasah's materials with her piece, Reborn Sounds. And I hope everyone gets to see it later on in the presentations. So today I wanted to share with you my perspective as a digital archivist regarding various ways gender is represented, specifically in Akkasah's collections. But since we'll be speaking a great deal about gaze and control and authority, I wanted to provide a caveat with regard to my credentials. Over my time at Akkasah, my role as an archivist has evolved. As I'm sure many of you know, in a small archive, everyone needs to be a generalist to some degree. I started my career as an archivist in 2016, more as a generalist, involved in the scanning of photos, but also, along with my colleagues, decisions around selection and description. But when we acquired a camera specifically designed for the scanning of cultural heritage materials, I gradually moved into a more technical role focused purely on digitization. Regardless of the size or resources of an archive, the core goal of archival work remains the same: to select, preserve, and make materials accessible to researchers and the public. And typically that work involves bringing some kind of subject expertise. In my case, that expertise doesn't come from being a historian or social or cultural anthropologist of the regions represented in Akkasah's collections. Instead, what I do bring is about a decade of close observation, especially of everyday vernacular photography of the region, and an ongoing attempt to understand what these images reveal. I welcome and even encourage any conversation regarding my authority in any part of my presentation. I think it's important to acknowledge this dynamic as I present myself as any kind of expert regarding the cultural motivations at work that affect gender representation in photo archives of the region. When focusing on one of the most critical category markers of human subjects in these images, gender, it's impossible for even an archivist to remain entirely objective when identifying the reasons that contribute to gender presences and absences, roles and tropes that repeat throughout and across time and geography. At Akkasah, we've tried to be intentional about this. We aim to include images that show men and women separately and together across different ages and contexts. But even with that effort, men are still overrepresented in many of our collections, significantly so in some cases. For example, using simply subject tags as our guide, and all images in Akkasah have object level description and subject tagging. Men are overrepresented by 62% in our Syria collection, but only by 7% in the Özge Kalifato collection, which focuses on Turkey. So how do these disparities develop? Quickly, I'd like to illustrate how what is held in a photo archive can be greatly influenced by the process of creation, custody, and selection. Representation begins with the creation of records, in this case, photos. Who took the picture, where and under what circumstances, and the autonomy of the subjects to choose to be photographed is a foundational factor in representation of all sorts. Then the custody of those images, whether they're kept in a secure environment, whether they're kept as an institutional record or part of a family archive, will also determine what materials survive in what order and in what context. At some point, these materials were accessioned by an archive, speaking about Akkasah. What is selected and what is shared will be critical to, in the case that we are discussing today, gender representation. In Akkasah's history, we have tried to select images from many cultures, nations, and communities within nations. But what we share publicly is shaped by our collection policy and often what a donor is willing to share. For instance, we have been approached by young people, students, eager to share their families' photos as a whole collection, only later for relatives to object to the sharing of images with, for example, women, particularly in informal home settings. I mention this only to demonstrate the numerous ways selection for photo archives can happen at many points in time, influenced by many people along the way. If we select material to align with modern sensibilities of diverse and proportional representation, could we not unintentionally distort the representative makeup of the original photographic record? What should our priority be? Accurate portrayals of gender norms as represented in photographs, a proportional selection of gender representation, or should we seek exceptions to the norms of the record to portray gender roles that reflect a more contemporary 21st century sensibility? We've actually had to grapple with these issues over the years building the Akkasah collections, and it's important to think about such considerations when viewing our finding aids, reading our descriptions, and considering the photos in our collections. In our collections, women appear in a range of contexts: social settings, work, leisure, and family life. But that breadth of representation is partly the result of curatorial choices, which raises a difficult question. If we actively try to balance representation, are we reflecting a historical reality or are we reshaping it? There's one series from our collection that really highlights some of these issues that I'd like to share with everyone. When viewing our collections through the lens of gender, we might ask how modern interpretations of gender and gender presentation might affect how we interpret representation in archives in general. In the Nebahat series of photographs from the Özge Kalafato collection, we collected a series of images dispersed amongst a much larger set of photographs from a single source in Turkey. Brought together as a series, they are a fascinating document of a single woman's self-presentation in what appears to be a perennial practice of visits to photo studios over the period of decades. At first, when the images were identified as the same person, we didn't know what to make of them from the perspective of gender presentation. We presumed the first in the series actually to be a man in profile. The modern reading of this image would perhaps be an individual with short hair wearing a garment with a low neckline and a lack of jewelry or other adornment. This led us to believe what we were viewing was a studio photograph of man. But when we realized that subsequent images in the collection were the same person, in contemporary lexicon, the individual was presenting themselves as a woman. But without further information about who this was, we were reluctant to make presumptions about the person's gender. Curiously, we had seen what appears to be some heavy retouching to either the print or the negative in places, which you can see in these images. Such a detail does not necessarily raise questions about the gender of the subject, but we were intrigued. Any single image in the series may have seemed unremarkable, but together they revealed a fascinating transformation of self-presentation over time. But who was this person? As revealed in Dr. Özge Kalafato's 2022 book, Making the Modern Turkish Citizen, Vernacular Photography in the Early Republican Era. The woman was Nebahat Hamit Karayoman, here standing outside of a teacher's school in 1934. She was an educator, an activist, and a fascinating feminist voice in modern early 20th century Turkey. I'm limited by time here, but I'd recommend that everybody attending today read about Nebahat's fascinating life, as well as Özge's deeper exploration of gender in her account of this photo series in her book. I wanted to share this example because it illustrates 2 points on the archival interpretive spectrum, if you will. How we presume to see gender in archives, and how critical it is to resist presumptions. To quote from Özge's book, The Modern Turkish Citizen, quote, her case reminds us of the perils of assessing gendered performances in historical visual material and urges us to question what our, quote, informed contemporary gaze may read into such material. Nebahat was both exceptional and yet representative of a modern woman in early Republican Turkey. But the series stands as an example of how archival practice can, when exercised with care, reveal gender and its assigned roles and visual cues to be more than the simple binary that subject tags may bluntly suggest. I'd like to conclude by saying the examples that I have laid out are part of an extremely small data set. As I mentioned, Akkasah consists of tens of thousands of photographs broadly across Southwest Asia and Turkey and North Africa. It consists of family photo albums, travel albums, a donated Emirati family collection, thousands of studio photographs from passport photos to family portraits. We have snapshots taken by families of families, and we have images taken at an obvious distance by members of the British military, of local people in various public settings. We've endeavored to create a collection representative of the vast diversity of cultures throughout the temporal and geographic landscape of our remit. And yet, we've barely scratched the surface of representation across many categories, including gender. I'd submit that the best archives, especially those emerging in the region, can do is not only own these gaps in representation, but to recognize that gender representation in archives is a result of numerous discrete choices over time, each choice influenced by the priorities and biases of the individuals and institutions making them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for your intervention. Please don't forget to write questions. I'm sure that you have several questions for Jonathan as far as his navigation as a archival practitioner of the challenges of working with archival collections in the Middle East. And now I give the floor to Ibrahim Ali. The floor is yours.
Hello, so you can see the presentation?
You can see the presentation and we can also hear you.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So hello everyone. First, I would like to thank the Kevorkian Center for organizing this event and for the kind invitation to take part in the webinar, and a special thanks to Roxana for all her efforts in coordinating with all of the speakers and with all the ongoing circumstances. So first, I would like to begin with sharing the following notes, just for clarity. So today, I'm not officially representing Al-Mawrid or the Akkasah or the NYU Abu Dhabi, as it has been mentioned in the introduction. My official role at NYU Abu Dhabi has been concluded in early 2026, in January 2026. However, my presentation will provide some insights and reflections on my experience of the work I have undertaken on several archival collections for over 4 years, from January 2022 until January 2026. Following that, I would like to share also like a few points that would apply to most, if not all, of the insights I will be talking about in my presentation. First, the details shared in this presentation should be understood in their historical, geographical, and cultural context. And at the same time, it should always be remembered that archival collections in most, if not all cases, are incomplete. And even if there are some comprehensive collections, but they would still miss some items while they include others. Therefore, and to create a better understanding and inclusive context and cataloging, usually, and it should be other resources should be considered in addition to archival collections in the research to have a better narrative and to address the gaps existing in archival collections. So the outline of my presentation will include the following points: a brief introduction to the archives and the collection of material types and objectives, who is featured in the image, and who tells a story which would reflect on the multi-layered structure of photographic materials and how context is developed through visual and textual layers. Gendered roles in archival formation, male curators and female custodians of archival collections, archival processing and representation, which is about preserving the male subtle presence and kinship relation identities in archival processing through authority files. And this is towards developing an equitable, neutral approach to enhance representation and discoverability. And then I will conclude with some reflections on education, access, and use of archival collections. So a brief introduction to the archives. Here is a very brief introduction about the Arab Art Archive collections. And these statistics date back to the end of 2025 and early 2026, so they might have changed by now. So at that time, the Al Mawrid Arab Art Archive has already secured to obtain 18 collections and digitize more than 40,000 digital objects and published 6 finding aids. And the main significance behind building the Arab Art Archive, because these collections comprise primary resources and rare archival materials that were either created or collected by the artists themselves. And then the objective was to preserve these collections and make them accessible through developing a sustainable and accessible digital repository. And the materials included in the Arab Art Archive collections, they vary a lot. They include photographic materials, exhibition materials, writings by the artist or writings on the artists, and press clippings and several other types of materials. The Akkasah Photography Archive, on the other hand, and as also my colleague Jonathan has explained, focuses more on vernacular photography from the Middle East and North Africa. It includes historical collections, albums, and contemporary photography projects. And the main objective for the Akkasah Archive is to contribute to preserving and providing access to photography collections in the region, and to both physical collections and digital collections. And all collections with their finding aids are published on the NYU Library's archival collections portal, and they are all accessible and they don't require any NYU credentials, so they are publicly accessible. So moving to the first kind of point of the presentation, who is featured in the image and who tells a story and the multi-layered structure of photographic image. And here I would like to share a few examples from the photo album collection in the Yasser Alwan collection, which is a foundational collection for the Akkasah Photography Archive. And here this will be just showing a few examples from the photographic albums and how the details and the different layers will inform the cataloging. So this is one example from the collection, and it shows like a personal album for a person that we know from the name printed on the cover, that his name Abdul Hamid Kamal. And however, the very high quality of the photographs inside the album and the several images, it lacks a lot of like details. There are no textual materials or handwritten notes, which would make it very challenging to create the cataloging for the photographic album. However, on the other hand, for this album, which is like a little bit less in terms of quality of the images, they are all kind of snapshots images taken by amateur photographers with a handheld camera And they both albums goes back to 1920s, 1930s, and both are from Egypt and collected by Yasser Elwan. But this album, when I cataloged it, I found several handwritten notes on the backs of most of the photographs, which were a very good resource for cataloging and for creating the context for the images. Moving to the second point, sorry for the, I'm talking a bit like with a speed just to keep with the time limit. So the gendered role in archival formations, and in this I will be sharing some reflections on two examples from the Arab Art Archive, which is the Rafi Nasiri and Mai Muzaffar collection and the Mahmoud Hamad collections. And in both collections, the curator or the author or the artist for the collection is a male person, Rafi Nasiri and Mahmoud Hamad. However, the custodian who maintained the collection and who was the source for the collection and preserved the legacy, and he was the source for telling the story, is a female, is a spouse or the wife of Rafi Nasiri, Mai Muzaffar, and Lubna Hamad. And both maintained and created a website. And also for case of Mai Muzaffar, she authored a lot of publications on Rafi Nasiri to preserve the legacy and also to tell the story, in addition to maintaining the archival collection and handing it to the Al-Mawrid for preservation, documentation, and cataloging and publishing. And here is a website for Mahmoud Hamad maintained by his daughter, Lubna Hamad. And following that point in terms of archival processing and representation, and to keep the highlight of the female role who is a custodian of the collection, I developed this protocol to include the names of the custodians, following the same protocol we established for the artists themselves, the author of the collection. And in addition to that, I maintained the link. I highlighted the link in the software in the backend, and therefore it was reflected also on the public user interface for the custodian. So whenever someone searches for the name of the artist or the custodian, they will both appear in the search along with the finding aid of the collection and the other authority records. So this was all to develop an equitable, neutral approach and to enhance the representation of the female custodians and their discoverability among the field. And as we can see here, if we search it, for example, for Dereya Fakhouri, she was a wife of Mahmoud Hamad, and her name is mentioned in a few materials from the collection of the Mahmoud Hamad, who was a Syrian artist. And here I created the, as part of the cataloging, the authority file for her, and highlighted the link and the relation with Mahmoud Hamad, the artist himself. So they are all linking and discoverable through the search. And the same was done for Lubna Hamad, who is a custodian for the collection. And reflecting at the end on education, access, and use, as part of our role as archivists, we used to provide presentations and deliver classes in various courses at NYU Abu Dhabi, Sorbonne University Abu Dhabi, and other universities in the region. And what I have noticed that the majority of the students in those classes from archive programs and from art history program and other relevant courses, the majority are females. And in addition to that, also the majority of the student assistantship, I would say 90% of the student assistants who were interested in joining all the opportunities that we have published were all also female. So that also reflect on the shift, I think, that has been happening in the region, that more females are interested in the fields of humanity, including archives and archival processing, and that also might have some influences or some reflections in the future on the field and on the work created in the field. The same also applies on research fellows and researchers who are requesting access and use of archival collections. Majority of the requests we have been receiving are from females. And here is an image from a symposium that was organized by Al-Mawrid in 2024, 2 years ago, Generative Archive Research Methods and Practice. And it brings professionals, scholars, and researchers from both fields of archives and art history. And again, the majority were female. So there is a huge increasing interest. I think it has started over the past 1 or 2 decades that more females are kind of showing interest in the field than males, and that might have some influences in the work created and the outputs created in those fields in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibrahim, very much. Wonderful point on the custodians and those who create archives and those who care about the archives. I will now give the floor to our second Ibrahim from ACOR, American Center of Research. And Ibrahim, you have the floor is yours. And please share your screen.
Yeah, 1 minute. I'm Ibrahim Rantisi. I am the archivist at ACOR Jordan. We have the biggest archive in Jordan, specialized in archaeology and heritage. We have around 70,000 pictures from Jordan and other countries in the region. We are also focusing on the daily life and preserving heritage in our archive, not just the archaeological sites. So today, we will discuss one of our main contributors, Jane Taylor. She was one of the first female archaeologists and authors to publish, 1 minute, to publish and record the history of Jordan. And one of her main specialties was aerial photography. Sorry, I had 1 minute. It's not skipping for some reason. So Jane Taylor was born in 1940, and she's a British photographer and author. And she didn't only live in the Middle East or just take pictures around the region. She was embedded deeply in the region, as she spent more than 3 decades through her lens and studies of the region. She was able to document and even write multiple books that are considered one of the most important heritage preserving books in the region. So her impact was highly valuable to our region because she has donated to our archive over 7,000 photos, spanning over 33 years, crossing borders from Egypt to Yemen, and of course with the special focus on Jordan. This collection is very powerful because she was able to capture places like Yemen and many historical sites in Yemen that currently are destroyed or partially destroyed by the ongoing war and the political situation over there. And her work was very outstanding because it was flowing between grand monuments, historical sites, but at the same time, she was able to capture the quiet and everyday lives of people among them. She was able to balance the human side with the archaeological side. And she was known for using humanitarian work and for supporting organizations like the UNICEF and the UN through her lens and her work. So, if we want to say, she was successfully able to go to war zones, especially during the Gulf War era, where she closely went to camps. She worked with refugees, with UNICEF, to document the devastating effects of the Gulf War and sanctions, particularly on Iraqi children and evacuees. she ensured that the human coast was preserved right alongside the region's history. So what makes her outstanding is her vision and her support to displaced people, and giving like the voice and documenting what happened to people in these regions, not just talking about the heritage and the cultural aspect only, like to show the perfect side of the region. She was able to show the region as is, like the beauty and the ugliness of war, while balancing both sides to show the full picture. And in my opinion, I think this is like what archiving is all about, is to give like the raw, real image. She was also, she worked in countries like Egypt, and she was like, it was very challenging for women in that period to go to countries like Egypt, to go to remote areas, take pictures and document such places. She was like the value, like she bypassed the standard tourist shots, the shots that we are used to see in Egypt. Instead, she photographed places like Qurna village in Luxor, where modern homes were built right among the ancient tombs. So she was able to merge the real life, the modern life with archaeology, not just focusing on ancient buildings or the image we are used to see, like the pyramids, the Sphinx, and the usual tourist images. By documenting remote monasteries and modern streets of Alexandria, for example, she was able to show us that history isn't dead. It is layered and it's a living environment. Like these places are still full of life, they are still inhabited, but it just has like a new modern layer over the ancient ruins that we all know about. So she was also she had a very vital role in Yemen, as I said earlier, because in 1995 she created a visual time capsule of the country, and she was able to document the mud brick high rises and the daily rhythms of these souks in Yemen. Today, as much of these sites face unprecedented modern threats, her detailed preservation of these fragile architectural forms is an inevitable gift to the global historians, because they were able to get a better understanding of the Yemeni architecture and the details. She was specialized in capturing the details of such buildings before they got like destroyed or affected by the ongoing war and situation in Yemen. To conclude, an archive, it's not just about like filling cabinets, having like pictures all over the place, as we already know. It's more about the value of the picture and the story behind them, and how you use these pictures to tell the story of a certain region or a certain nationality. So Jane Taylor Archive shows us exactly why women contributions are essential, because she seamlessly connected the grand macro history of the Middle East with the intimate, often painful realities of its people. So she was able to show us the beauty, the history, the power of the Middle East, but at the same time, the fragile side and the human side next to each other. Like she was able to give us the full story, not just focusing on one aspect. By valuing both the stones and the human resilience of the region, she left us with a true, more complete historical record. So, for example, when you see the pictures of the region in the 90s, they are not detached. Like it will show you the historical sites, the daily life, but at the same time, the struggles, the wars, what was going on in the region. Not just one dimension of that era, which makes it more and more human. And like to conclude this, I want to highlight that she also was a pioneer in aerial photography. Her aerial photography work, she was the first female in Jordan, although she's not Jordanian, but she was the first female to be able to document Jordan from the aerial view. She used to go and use hot air balloons. She used to use military helicopters before the age of drones and the new technologies. And she published a book in 2005 about Jordan, and it had a huge collection of aerial photos of the main sites and historical sites in Jordan. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ibrahim. I do hope that in the questions, in the Q&A, we can reflect more on the positionality of Jane Taylor as a woman, but also not as a Jordanian. And also we can discuss a bit more about other collections that are in ACOR and the idea of the woman as the archivist, of Jane Taylor as the archivist, the one who creates, and whether there are other women at ACOR who did exactly that. So please, I remind you to include your questions in the chat so we can have a productive conversation after the presentations. But before that, I will give the word to Hadeel. Hadeel will also have an intervention and tell us a bit about her thinking process in creating the archival activation. And I will let her speak more about this. The floor is yours, Hadeel.
Thank you, Roxana. So I wanted to give a bit of a look into the process of the project. So I began the process of the archival activation titled Reborn Sounds by searching New York University's Akkasah archive, which largely contained family photo albums and more recent collections from the 2000s. I was drawn to the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company collection because it clearly illustrated the marginalization of communities as a consequence of the oil industry. The collection is largely concerned with the construction of oil facilities in Aden and the Little Aden refinery's operation in the summer of 1954 in British-occupied Yemen. The individuals in the collection are more of an afterthought. And as I looked through the pictures, I was struck by the lack of autonomy, as subjects rarely looked at the camera or seemed in command of the photographs, save for one picture, which is, of course, of the photographer himself, a British representative of the company. He is the only person with the privilege of confronting the camera on his own terms. The actual project started with a question when looking at this particular photograph on the screen. I noticed the radio in the background, and it seemed like a through line. The archive's limitations and incompleteness has been addressed in different ways, most notably, perhaps, Saidiya Hartman's approach of reconstructing its stories and trying to fill the gaps through research, while Iman Mirsal talks about how an archive cannot be a search for the truth, because to find the truth, you would have to ask the right question, and how could you know what the right question is? Both approaches are sincere in their own efforts, but to me, the most important facet of this project was to be wary of ventriloquizing the voiceless, as Mirsal puts it, especially because the subjects being muted by the archive does not render them voiceless. This is evident in one audio clip in the activation where a Yemeni man stands up to a group of British soldiers and is yelling over and over again, "I'm man." This is why that radio became so significant. It gave me a space to imagine within the archive as an attempt to connect with these subjects without imposing on them. So the whole activation was born out of the question, what was playing on that radio? This question also helped me poke holes in the photographer's supposed objectivity. As I began to imagine a song playing on the radio, I realized that the photographer would probably not understand it. I then started to notice the lack of females in the photographs because of his inability to access female social and domestic spaces. And so slowly, the power projected in these photos began to be demystified. The project's attempt at contextualizing the collection led me to research the history of 1960s Yemeni radio under British occupation and the story of singer Taqiyya Tawiliya. Bringing her voice to the project, it grounded the photos in her life, if only through imagination. I supplemented the project by piecing together different parts of each of these stories, The more I wanted to incorporate audio evidence at that time, the more I began relying on alternative collections found across social media websites or video hosting platforms. And I weaved these narratives into the images. And so this project is a rejection of the reality offered in the collection, a refusal to define the subjects of the photograph by their capturer. This gesture extends beyond this particular photographer to all colonial archives. By breaking the subject's passivity through imagining the sounds of the photographs, they appear closer and more human. It is an exercise in empathizing with subjects of archives. And throughout this project, I was ultimately guided by my own curiosity and the stubborn hope that I will one day ask the right question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hadeel, for that wonderful presentation and also for engaging so thoughtfully and critically with the archival material from Akkasah. And now to open the discussion, I'm gonna give the word to Julia, who is gonna make a small intervention of her own and then open with a few questions for our panelists, and then we will dive into the discussions. Julia, the floor is yours.
Good evening or good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. I also want to thank everyone, Roxana in particular. She engaged with me in discussion, and I think I'm going to do like a kind of disclaimer, like some of my colleagues, in not being a subject specialist in terms of gender, and bringing here more like my expertise, my experience, okay, as an archivist, maybe also as a woman, but or both things, working in the region. So thanks to everyone. I found so I had some notes, but something it's popped up after the discussion. One thing is that like I found it very interesting that like we saw the gender, meaning female. That's another thing. Maybe it's good to. I mean, we say gender, and then we mean female mainly. We saw first the women as a subject of pictures with Jonathan, and then with Ibrahim Ali, he mentioned women as custodian. And with Ibrahim Rantis, instead, we had women as producer. And well, with Adil, I hope that everyone that is attending had the chance to see her work. We see women, okay, as creator, first of all, but also as a singer. So we heard their voice. So I found that this was very, maybe unintentionally, but very interesting. And I also think that this presentation are a very valuable combination because they're putting different approaches to the topic of gender. One comes from the archival science point of view, and that's what most of our colleagues brought. And you have heard talking about digitization, authority file. So this kind of standard and classification that we use in archives to organize the material. And on the other side, Adeel took the archival material out of the safety, let's say, or archival proof context of archives, and it connected it with the lives of what lives outside the archives, or at least with what she was mentioning also the Western notion of what an archive is, and connected like to what lives on the internet, for instance. And in this way, she made us feel something that I really think feel it's a good verb, that maybe the metadata wouldn't do in an archival description. So I think this was very interesting. And also somehow maybe I have like an excusation that was prompted without a request. That's some kind of translation that I have from this Latin way of saying. So I kind of interrogate a lot myself when I was ahead of this talk about this kind of rigidity that the archival institution might have. Especially for, I guess, for a researcher or for someone that is using them for a research, as a resource. And I was thinking that like institutions like archives and libraries and museums in the way that we understand them today. It's not the only form of knowledge protection, but they were largely established in the region, and not only in the region, but in the region during the colonial period. And among the many things that they reflect, and I don't want to enter this topic, they also reflect a particular way of organizing the world and knowledge by classifying it and defining dividing it into categories. And this was presented as a very rational way of organizing knowledge, but of course, like rational doesn't mean neutral. And this gatekeeping activity is very much informed by culture and also policy, the policies, agendas, and ultimately power. I mean, like about the reality of a certain society, of a certain moment. So the archive actually, it's at this very root from the word itself coming from his Greek roots. It speaks about the place of the ruler. Like it comes from that. So I think it's a very powerful connection to the idea of power. And and I think that gender is just one of the things that is maybe not part is not seen in the archive. It's part of many other things like race, geography, and language. So there are, I thought that this was interesting and to see. And then also that the term archive, instead always going to the language, it has also other roots, especially in Arabic, and then they go back to the idea of, for instance, of protection and of preservation, and this made me also of care also, I would say. And I think somehow it's also interesting to see that how we find that female, I mean, I think that they are of care, of keeping the memory and somehow preserve, was also something that we say that like sometimes it was something that was performed by women, often in terms of hair, for example. But also, I mean, the roots of archive in Arabic can also go back to the idea of something that it's solid, that it's firm, with Dar al-Wata'i. So what I mean is that behind the idea of the archive, so I saw, okay, the idea of power, but also an idea of protection and trust. Because in the end, I mean, society needs to find a place where to entrust the conservation of knowledge. It needs somewhere, a place to stay that outlasts even the creators. And however imperfect and partial, it's there. And maybe what we have to work on, especially in terms of gender and in terms of, in general, things that are not maybe very that are less represented in archive, it's this kind of trust that I think an archive can have, especially by him declaring somehow what's inside the archive, what is missing, declaring its gap. And I think it's something that, like, for instance, I heard from the presentation and the conversation that we had, without necessarily filling these gaps. I mean, it can be done, and curatorial selection can somehow work on this. But in general, this operation, it's still something that is very tied to the society, to the time. So yeah, that's some of the things that I thought about. And I don't know if maybe this can come back in our question. I have actually a lot of questions for our speaker. And the main one actually is not super related, not either to the gender or power or what I have discussed now, but it has to do with the relationship between image and text. I thought about it, especially looking at the work of Hadeel. But it's also something that I think it's very interesting in archive. And so for my archival colleagues, I wanted to ask, how do you manage and represent text in relation with the image? Could be in cataloging or in digitization, and not just technically. I mean, if you want to sell something, it's fine. But for me, it's also like how this does this help with the interpretation of the image, somehow filling that gap, or maybe can text say something that the image cannot say, especially, I mean, we said like in terms of having women represented in some collection. So it was, yes, this idea of the relationship between image and text. And for Hadeel too, it's kind of the same question, but it's more related about like, I said the end of the archival activation. So I saw the album that, and from the description, I saw that like there was not much text maybe in this album, but you still choose to use some text at the end. And so I wanted to ask you why you choose that piece and why you decided to create this extract. And yeah, and instead like and you also use music. So also maybe I want to ask you like, what do you think it's more powerful between text and music for describing and supporting your project?
So please feel free to start answering the questions as you see fit, whether the panelist or whether Hadeel would like to intervene. The floor is yours.
I can start. Sometimes connecting the text with the image can be really tricky. For example, I had a collection of 5,000 pictures. It was full of thematic inscriptions on stones in Wadi Rum. So, like, I don't understand the thematic language. It's an ancient prehistoric language. It has many strange symbols, signs, and even some of the rocks have like different eras, like Roman, Arabic, Thamodic. So it was one of the most challenging collections to write text or to add the metadata to, because the pictures were taken before the age of GPS, and they are like random rocks all over the desert in a very massive area. So we couldn't locate the exact locations. We couldn't understand what is written on the rocks. And it was a bit tricky to identify, but I was able to find the books of the person who took the pictures, Mr. Dobling. He unfortunately passed away, which is another challenge. So I was able to find his books, to read some of his studies, to be able to decode or at least find a general understanding of the collection and try to write different metadata for each pictures. So sometimes we have to repeat almost the same metadata because we don't have enough information or the accuracy to exactly identify what we are looking at. So it was one of the cases that I want to share.
Can I ask you, maybe you didn't meant, I was just thinking, is there, I wait.
Oh, no. I was just going to say, to add on to the challenges of description, and I saw, I think, a comment in the Q&A about AI and how it impacts. So, there are, I think, I think people are trying to engage AI to help with archival description, but I don't think we're at the point where we can engage AI with archival description without human scrutiny of what's presented. And part of that is, at Akkasah, for instance, we had to come up with our own standards for description because of the Western lens through most archives. Of course, we would use Library of Congress, standards as a starting point, but we found many challenges with the language that we used, especially which centers the West in description, for instance, around regional dress, and we would say traditional dress, meaning not a flannel suit with a tie, shirt and tie. It was the sort of othering of it. And so we tried to come up with a new language for how to describe, but also while being careful to describe purely what we can see and not overreaching. When we see a man and a woman in an image who appear to be wearing wedding clothes, we can infer that this is a wedding between a man and woman. This is a bride and groom. But in some contexts, we don't know. It could be a father and daughter, it could be a brother and sister. We don't like to make presumptions like that. So, and we do our best to both use language that can reveal as much as possible and be searchable as such, so that if people were searching the archive, the language would be there for discovery based on what they're probably looking for, but also while keeping a sort of critical eye towards the exact words that we're using, whether it's cultural, not using more Western terms or Western centering of description, or the centering of description around you know patriarchy or what have you. So I think that it is something that we would always at Akkasah, we've always had long conversations about specific words that we would use in certain circumstances. And I think one of the exciting things about photo archives in this region is exactly that. We're trying to come up with a new language, a new way of describing that, of course, embraces the tradition, but also acknowledges the challenges of that tradition that need to be adjusted for our use.
If I may add.
Yes, yes, go Ibrahim. Go Ibrahim.
Yeah, okay. Just for the text and the images, especially again adding to what Jonathan has just mentioned, especially in case of vernacular photography collections, and because those collections are in most cases are collected from booksellers and flea markets, so they lack a lot of like the details about the context. So whenever we come across any handwritten notes on the back of the photographs or as captions in the albums, and even when I was cataloging albums, I was trying to, when I can do that safely without damaging the photographs, like to flip and see if there are handwritten notes on the back side of the photographs, because those would be a valuable like resource for the information that will kind of use in the cataloging and for creating and developing the finding aid or the item level description for the images. And at the same time, and on the other hand, they would tell some aspects about the personality of the person or the family who kept and maintained the collection, and how much they cared about adding notes and keeping the photographs together, and how many details they intended to keep on in terms of captions or on the inside cover of the album in terms of dates and who is featured in the image. So it works on both levels. It's like as a source for information for the cataloging, and also it shows like how these collections or these photographs or albums were valuable to the person or the family who put them together and maintained them.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Hadeel, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I can answer Julia's question about using text at the end of the activation. I think when I was coming up with the project, so much of it was this emphasis on imagination and kind of a hypothetical space or time. But in using or in researching, I did find, as is very abundant, a lot of very intense language in these colonial documents. And I wanted to include that in the project to emphasize that as much as I would emphasize the imagination and the hypothetical, that a lot of this is grounded in actual facts and events and documents, and it's not just interpretation. Yeah.
If I may continue with a question, Julia?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to thank for the answer. I think it's very interesting that like the text can ground things, and that's maybe what happened in Hadeel's work. And I think that like when it give context, I mean, maybe sometimes can we cannot change the image that we have, although maybe sometimes the image are not corresponding to the reality of the time or whatever, but or they are not respective of the current sensibility, but we can sometimes, maybe language can help out mitigating this or putting in context on representing things that we want to highlight, and working on this to ground things also to the situation, and to be as honest as possible. I think honesty, and it's a very, I describe the situation, the approach that we try to have.
Mm-hmm. I do have a question that it's for all of us, but it has also been triggered by a lot of discussions that I had with Jonathan, and like in current archival practices, and also it's I think there is a bit of a Western sensibility of digitize everything, reveal everything, show everything, make everything public, right? And then the question is, but what if some things should not be shown? Right? So what if some things should not be public? So it's a question for all of you, if you can tell us how you navigated, like this desire to make publicly available, to digitize, with maybe like in the case of Jonathan, cultural sensibilities of what is supposed to be shown and what is supposed to be hidden. And this also goes again to the notion of trust. So I'm interested for you as practitioners how you navigated these challenges.
I can speak first, I guess. It's I think that is really central to our practice and the way that we have accession materials. As Ibrahim mentioned, a great deal of our collection came from just boxes of photographs found in a bookshop in Turkey, and with no context other than what's written on them or what visible clues there can be. Nobody in those images probably could even conceive of the idea of them being digitized, shared online. There is no consent other than our ownership of those photographs. And we do have, of course, a takedown policy where if someone were to reach out to us and say, hey, that is a relative or that is me, or then we would, of course, take the materials down. So I think that that's something that every kind of vernacular archive would have to struggle with. I think that we struggle with this with images that are taken in public with people in the background. I think that's becoming more and more an issue, especially with AI and face recognition and that sort of thing. So, yeah, so I think that we do our best to identify people, as we can. And to mention, we've only had one person in our whole history reach out to us and say we had a random couple of people, on the on an image, and someone reached out to us, said, that's me and my little sister, and of course, please feel free to keep it up and share it. I can only think of one or two images that we had accessioned in one of these sort of bulk purchases that we did not share just because that they weren't appropriate, and were the person to see it, the context of the photograph might have been very embarrassing. And so we did not include that. Although we did scan it, we have a copy of it in the archives, but it's not shared in the finding aid. We've talked about a lot of the albums. We have our albums that were put together by members of the Royal Air Force in Iraq in mid-20th century, and a lot of the language that is used is extremely degrading and inappropriate. There's poems published that are by contemporary standards pretty vile, and we have to balance sharing it with and it goes back to what I was saying before about this idea of do we edit the reality to match our sensibilities, or do we share what we have and explain the context and hope that people can take it in the spirit of research material. And I think for the most part, that is what we have done. We do have notes at the beginning of some of our albums mentioning some of the some of the language that's used in it. I would say on the Arab art archive side, where we scan the collections of artists, a lot of what we scan are diaries and records and that sort of thing, where we will keep that private because there's a lot of very, very private thoughts in them. And part of the contract with the families, with the donors, are to create limited access. And we have different tiers of access where we want people to be able to access everything digitally. So, we digitize what we can, but in terms of access to that digital material, some of it will be on an open finding aid through the NYU system. Some of it we may provide digital copies based on request. Some materials we would say you can only view these materials if you visit us and we can discuss context, how it will be used, and that sort of thing. And sometimes it might even involve bringing in the donors or the families themselves. So I think there's different levels to how we work around those issues of access to potentially private materials. We mentioned earlier, I have, one of our collections is a collection of donated by an Emirati family. It was a negotiation with the family, what we would show and what we would not. We digitized their collection for them, but then we sat with them and said, what do you feel comfortable with having in the permanent archive? And that was a learning experience for us. It's difficult because going back to all of these questions about gender and representation, and the lens and who's taking the image, who's sharing the image, how much of that is appropriate to edit, and is it somehow intellectually dishonest to present this as an accurate record of a family when we know that it is not a whole picture? That's a really tough question for any archivist to answer, because I don't think you can ever, through photographs, represent something accurately. I think that it's always going to be up to interpretation. Even if you were to present every single photograph, every image in a family's collection, the idea that that somehow brings you closer to a truth, I think, is also a bit dangerous to think about. So that's my reaction. I'm happy to elaborate if anyone has any more questions about my thoughts.
May I ask just a quick follow-up question in relation to gender? What would be some of the options, like for you, as a Western male archivist in dealing with these archives? Like, how did you have to negotiate your position as an archivist and as a professional in relation to these archives, where you have these requirements from the family?
I think a lot of it has been, I'll be honest, it's a question I've asked myself, as I mentioned at my presentation, that I started off as sort of a generalist involved with a lot of description, and I did it with colleagues who had more connections, ties to the region, and ties to Arabic language skills, a lot of things that I don't have. And I think that part of that deficit in my profile is what kind of led me more towards the digitization and the purely technical, scanning the image, thinking of these as objects, and that I think was helpful. But I think that in response to that, though, I would say I think a part of what has helped us with these questions has been being at a liberal arts university with students and faculty. It's why I believe that archives such as Akkasah really do have a place at universities, because I like to use the example in Akkasah, we have a collection called the Samir Farid collection. There are negatives, about 3,000 negatives that were shot on the sets of Egyptian films, the Golden Age cinema from the 1930s, really through we have images all the way through the 1980s. They're really wonderful photographs, many of which haven't been seen before. And we received them in envelopes with the name of the film written in Arabic. So we both had to confirm that that was the actual film that was represented in those images. But many of those film titles had never been translated into English before. And the responsibility of an archive is not just describing things accurately, but when you add something to the record, such as a translation from Arabic to English. And what I found myself doing was taking some of these titles that there's two sites. There's IMDb, of course, and then El Cinema, which is sort of a database of Egyptian cinema. For those films that had never been translated, we reached out to students to translate, and we would have students who were more familiar with the Gulf dialect or, Levant dialect or Egyptian dialect, and each one would have a different take on it. And because they were Egyptian films, we had one Egyptian student say to us, many of them were kind of untranslatable. They translated to an idiom that didn't directly translate. And so it really felt in certain points where we want to post the English translation. We try to have both. We have, our site does allow for toggling between English and Arabic, but we want to have an English translation. And by assigning an English name to a film that had never been translated by any of the creators, if people then search for that, that will be seen as the record. And so I think that goes across all archives from a Western, and it's one of my sensitivities that I don't want to say anything that has a sort of cultural judgment to it, because that will be seen. There is something about the authority of archives that people will see a description, whether it's a translation or otherwise, and they will see it as the truth. And we try to be very careful about that. It's something I'm still struggling with the Samir Farid collection in terms of what to name things. And I think part of it also, it goes into, archives are not just, here's an image, here's us describing the image, here's some subject tags. There is a massive amount of other data that goes into it and describing how it was arranged, how it was translated. And so we can go into that detail further in the collection accession and resource notes.
Great. Ibrahim or Hadeel, any points of view?
Yeah, if I may add just to what Jonathan has mentioned in detail, that like being aware of that sensitivity of some materials, especially writings and something like the journals that artists like most likely have never thought that they will end up in an archive and made accessible to students or researchers. So we, to kind of compromise or like overcome that challenge while trying to make a balance between kind of taking the cultural context into consideration and also preserving the materials and making them accessible. So we usually start with an agreement with a custodian or the owner of the collection, where we explain during a discussion, we explain our process, our practices, and the various levels of access that we can provide. And also we kind of negotiate with them what materials that we can acquire and we can process and make accessible. And we consider all their kind of perspectives. So for that, also, we have developed these different levels of access where we publish images from different series online and make them publicly available. And this, in the most cases, especially for the case of the Arab Art Archive collections, are the materials that have been already published and distributed before, like exhibition materials and the press clippings. While some materials like the writings by the artist, especially if they are journals and have never been published before, we still digitize them for preservation and we keep them, but we provide them what we can call controlled access. So we provide access to them upon request, and we provide this access at the center. So we would know who accessed what materials and at what time, and we would ask
if they request to use those images from those materials, we request them to fill out and submit a request form that we have developed with several statements and acknowledgements that specifies all of this cultural context and sensitivity, and also in addition to the copyright restrictions and so on. So we would kind of try to build these different levels of access, public access and controlled access, to compromise and also between the cultural sensitivity and sensitivity of some of the information mentioned in the materials, and also providing access to researchers so they can still consult the materials and include them in their research.
So now I have a final question. Well, the questions are coming, but a question for Ibrahim Rantisi, but also applies to everyone. And it's more about how collections like those of Jane Tyler are being redescribed or enriched today, especially that most of these already have inherited metadata shaped by non-local perspectives. So this is also tied to the idea of reflecting on Jane Tyler as a woman, and it is great. We have this celebratory dimension of unveiling women's works, but at the same time, Jane Tyler is a Western white woman. So I'm wondering whether ICWER has reflected on this dimension, on the tensions between bringing these two identities of Jane Tyler together.
Yes, of course. The people who added the metadata and worked on the collections were Arabs. So part of our role is confirming the locations, confirming the places, making sure that even one of the challenges related to translation, that, for example, if I want to talk about the Beit Ras region, it has different spellings in English because it's not the native language. So we usually go to the official geographical center in Jordan to take the accurate translation of that area, so many researchers can view it. So when you are as a local person, you can easily identify the cultural sensitivity behind the picture, what to share, what not to share, how to write the metadata regarding the dynamics and the politics of the region. And as you can see, our region is shifting very fast from a political aspect. So sometimes we had to restrict some items, rewrite some metadata to just adjust to the political geopolitics of the region, especially the pictures related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or pictures of Yemen, for example. So you should use your judgment, because each picture is unique. There's no one rule that applies to all. It's case by case.
Do any other of you have any replies? Because I also think this raises a larger question of all the guests here are part of institutions. There are Western institutions in a place that deals with with the Middle East, and I'm just curious whether there have been discussions and reflections, especially given the time, on the positionality of these institutions and the archives, and the work that we can do. So if there are any ideas that come to mind before I ask the final question and we conclude, that would be great. No? Great. Then let's go to the final question. How do you treat the archive as a site of fragments and absence, since it's always incomplete, especially in the Arab region, or as Hadeel mentioned, it's hard to have access to female domestic spaces? Is there any methods to work with such archives? So it's just a curiosity of how have you tried to work with absences and not always wanting to fill them, right? So the floor is yours.
I think that absences, I love talking about this with students, especially in an age where we have so much ubiquity of photographs and digital visual records of everything going on around us. When we look back, it's important to remember that when we see a photographic record of a time and place, it is not a full record of that time and place. It's a record of that, it's a portion of the record that has survived of a time and place of people who had the money and the access to the technology to be able to take those images. So I think with photo archives in particular, you will never have a full record. And I think that part of our difficulty with filling in regional gaps in our collection, where we want to have greater, a greater spread of covering more geographic area and cultures from different parts of the map. I think that there's a couple of difficulties. One of which is that we are sensitive to the idea that we don't want to be a big vacuum sucking in, materials. There is an idea that materials ideally should live in institutions in the place where those materials should be used and accessed by the people who they represent. So there's that. But there's also the idea of, so having one central repository that has a complete, a complete picture of everything, I think even were it to exist would probably be problematic in its own right. But that said, I think that seeking out the gaps, and that's sort of where access to the archives and the researchers and the people who access the archives, I think that by owning those gaps and saying, we do our best, this is what we have, we can, there is the archival practice justification for the gaps. And then there is the, the cultural, the bias, all of those things that go to what was selected and why. And those gaps may be there as well. I can identify both, I think, in Akkasah. I think some of the images that we kind of had as keystone images that we use a lot to represent, I think they have a sense of whimsy to them, or humor, or poignance, that may represent something that is not necessarily intellectually rigorous and don't necessarily represent the people of whom the picture was a community, a part of that community. So I think that, but I think that it's a problem, but I think it's the case there is no final full record. And I think especially in cultural heritage archives, if you have a business archive with records, you can tell this story. But I think especially with photo archives, the idea is, I think, difficult. Yeah.
And finally, just for Hadeel, would you like to sum up everything? Would you like to tell us how you dealt with silences? Because you've done it in a wonderful way.
Yes, of course. I think I do largely agree with what Jonathan has mentioned about the archive is perpetually incomplete. This is just the state of how it is. And to address the question that was posed, I think to me it's about changing the attitude towards trying to find any truths within an archive, because it is as much fiction as it is fact, and that is not, to stray away from an archive, but it is something to always keep in mind. Because I remember Iman Mirsal saying, the image exists for the purpose of remembering what is absent from it. And I think that is something that is constantly true to me as someone who seeks out an archive. And this even ties to what is this question in the chat about mitigating biases in an archive. I think that also comes with trying to interpret what is in front of you. You ultimately have to confront your own biases and address them and be okay with them.
Thank you so much to everyone who has joined us, to the panelists. It's a huge honor to be in a conversation with you and that you made the time in these difficult moments to be with us.